Welcome back, dwellers of the wasteland. Today, we are descending into the shadowed corridors of power that survived the Great War, examining the military and governmental machinery of the Enclave, the self-proclaimed United States government that sealed itself away when the bombs fell. We will explore their presidential succession through the ashes, their military hierarchy that maintained pre-war protocols in a post-war hell, their research divisions that turned survival into genocide, and the command structures that stretched from oil rigs in the Pacific to bunkers carved into Appalachian mountains, all in service of a nation that existed only in their conviction that authority could outlast the people it claimed to serve. In the moments before the Great War consumed the world in atomic fire, certain men and women disappeared into the earth, carried downward on elevators that would not rise again for generations. They were not random survivors clutching lottery tickets to vault doors. They were the architects of America's shadow government, the continuity planners who had always known the missiles would fly, who had prepared bunkers not for the people but for the concept of governance itself. The Enclave, as they would come to call themselves, represented the notion that even after 200 million dead, even after the Constitution burned and Congress vaporized in nuclear light, the United States government could persist as more than memory. It could persist as structure, as hierarchy, as the skeletal framework of a nation that no longer existed except in the minds of those who sealed themselves away from the ashes. The presidential succession ran through oil rig corridors like a river of paranoia given form. Dick Richardson stood as president though no electorate had chosen him, no inauguration ceremony witnessed by crowds on a Capitol lawn, now converted to radioactive glass. His authority derived from emergency protocols activated when the bombs fell, when vice president to Speaker of the House all vanished in the same thermonuclear instant. Richardson inherited power through a chain of survivorship that read like a casualty list, each name crossed out until his remained improbable and absolute. Behind him stretched a line of succession that existed more in theory than practice, congressional remnants who held their titles like relics, men who represented districts that were craters, who chaired committees, overseeing departments reduced to filing cabinets in steel bunkers. The Supreme Court existed as a theoretical construct, 3 justices who had made it to the oil rig, not enough for a quorum, but enough to maintain the legal fiction that judicial review persisted somewhere in the darkness. These emergency constitutional provisions had been drafted in the paranoid fever of the Cold War, when planners conceived of limited nuclear exchange of targeted strikes that might decapitate leadership but leave infrastructure intact. No one had imagined the totality of October 23, 2077, the complete immolation of surface civilization. Yet the protocols activated anyway, their language, adapting to circumstances their authors never conceived. Presidential powers expanded to encompass everything because there was nothing left to constrain them. Martial law became permanent when there was no civilian authority to restore. Emergency measures stretched across decades, then centuries. The temporary made eternal by the simple fact that the emergency never ended. The Enclave governed according to a constitution written for a nation of 300 million, applied to a population of perhaps 3,000, the ratio rendering every article absurd, yet somehow sacred. Military rank structure on the oil rig followed pre-war hierarchies with the rigid precision of men clinging to the familiar in an alien world. Private to corporal, to sergeant, the enlisted ranks maintained their distinctions even when everyone shared the same recycled air, ate the same reconstituted rations, cleaned the same weapons that had not fired at human targets in decades. Lieutenants commanded squads that drilled on platforms suspended over the Pacific, running tactical exercises for enemies that remained theoretical. Captains oversaw companies, majors coordinated battalions, all preserved in amber like military organizational charts viewed through nuclear glass. The colonel rank carried particular weight, men like Autumn Sr., who commanded entire wings of the Enclave's military apparatus, whose authority stemmed not from battlefield prowess, but from decades of navigating the political currents that swirled through sealed corridors. Full colonels reported to brigadier generals who answered to major generals who stood before the chief of staff himself, subordinate only to the president in his dual role as commander-in-chief. The Secret Service detail that shadowed Richardson represented perhaps the strangest adaptation of pre-war function to post-war reality. They wore the same dark suits their predecessors had worn, tailored from salvaged fabric stores, dry cleaned in facilities that consumed precious resources. Their earpieces connected to security networks, monitoring threats that came not from assassins in crowds, but from potential coup plotters in adjacent departments, from the creeping paranoia that infected any closed system running for too long. They protected a president who ruled over an empire of rust and radiation, whose motorcade consisted of vertibirds rather than limousines, whose foreign policy concerned itself with whether to exterminate surface dwellers or merely enslave them. Yet, they maintained their protocols, their watch rotations, their threat assessments, because abandoning those structures meant confronting the absurdity of their entire existence. Control Station ENCLAVE rose from the Pacific like a monument to pre-war industrial ambition, a Poseidon Energy oil rig converted into the last true seat of American government. Its departmental structures sprawled across multiple levels, each section color-coded, and access-controlled movement between them requiring authorization that flowed through bureaucratic channels, as complex as any pre-war federal building. Civilian sectors occupied the upper levels where families lived in quarters designed for oil workers, spaces converted into permanent residences, complete with schools teaching children about a surface world they had never seen, cafeterias serving meals from hydroponic gardens, and protein synthesizers recreation areas where people played at normalcy while the Pacific crashed against struts corroded by salt and time. Military quarters descended deeper barracks arranged by rank, and unit armories stocked with weapons maintained in perfect condition for wars that remained distant possibilities. Soldiers trained in gymnasiums converted from equipment storage, practicing small unit tactics in corridors, too narrow for real combat, their skills growing sharp through repetition, even as actual battlefield experience remained abstract. The power armor bays occupied their own level cavernous spaces where technicians maintained the suits that represented the Enclave's primary tactical advantage. The advanced power armor variants that made a single soldier worth a squad of wastelanders. These suits stood in rows like sleeping giants, their servo motors silent, their fusion cores idling, waiting for deployment orders that came with increasing frequency as Richardson's genocidal ambitions crystallized into operational planning. Research levels stretched deeper still, laboratories where scientists worked on projects that would have horrified their pre-war counterparts, though perhaps not by much. The FEV research conducted here built upon experiments begun at Mariposa West Tech's legacy, continuing in facilities designed for petroleum analysis, now converted to biological warfare development. Curling 13 represented their most ambitious undertaking, a modified FEV strain designed to target genetic markers to distinguish between enclave personnel protected by genetic purity and surface dwellers whose DNA carried mutations accumulated through radiation exposure. The virus would kill selectively, sweeping across the wasteland like an invisible tide, leaving only those with pre-war genetic profiles intact. The scientists who developed this worked in sealed chambers, their calculations performed on terminals that hummed with pre-war code, their ethical considerations sublimated to patriotic duty to the restoration of America, even if that restoration required the death of everyone who currently inhabited its corpse. If you are still with me after hearing this, hit that like and subscribe button. The reactor maintenance divisions occupied the lowest accessible levels of the oil rig, where the thrum of fusion cores provided the heartbeat that sustained everything above. Engineers rotated through shifts monitoring coolant, systems that had run far beyond their design lifespan, patching leaks with materials scavenged from pre-war depots, their work performed in heat that made the air shimmer even through environmental suits. These were the forgotten specialists of the Enclave hierarchy, men whose technical expertise kept the lights burning, but whose names never appeared on organizational charts that mattered. They worked in spaces where the Pacific's pressure groaned against reinforced bulkheads, where one catastrophic failure would send the entire structure plunging into depths that would crush titanium like aluminum foil. They understood intimately that their floating fortress existed in defiance of physics and time, that everyday Control Station Enclave remained above water represented a small miracle of engineering and improvisation. The departmental organization followed pre-war federal structures with almost religious devotion, as if maintaining bureaucratic categories could preserve the government they represented. The Department of the Army maintained its own wing, its command staff coordinating units that existed more on paper than in practice, phantom divisions assigned to bases that were radioactive craters. Yet, they filed reports, maintained equipment readiness logs, conducted personnel reviews that determined promotions within a military that fought no wars, faced no peer adversaries. The regular infantry units drilled endlessly, their training focused on counterinsurgency operations against enemies who used pipe rifles and leather armor tactical scenarios that never quite captured the reality of wasteland combat. These soldiers believed in their mission with the fervor of the isolated, convinced that surface dwellers represented not survivors, but contaminated threats to be neutralized, that their eventual emergence would constitute liberation rather than conquest. The power armor divisions represented the Enclave's elite troops who wore the Hellfire variants that made even Brotherhood paladins seem primitive. These suits incorporated technology that pushed pre-war science into new territory, ceramic plating that could withstand plasma fire, targeting systems that interfaced directly with the wearer's neural pathways, servo motors powerful enough to rip a Deathclaw's head from its shoulders. The soldiers who piloted these suits trained in specialized facilities where they learned to move, as extensions of the armor itself, to think in terms of overlapping fields of fire and power management, to become weapons platforms that happened to contain human operators. Their esprit de corps bordered on arrogance, the justified confidence of troops who knew they could walk through anything the wasteland could field and emerge victorious. Vertibird assault squads formed the Enclave's rapid response capability pilots, who flew machines that represented pre-war aerial dominance, translated into post-war reality. These aircraft had evolved from pre-war designs, their tilt rotor configurations allowing vertical takeoff from the oil rig's cramped helipads, their armament packages capable of reducing settlements to burning craters in minutes. Pilots spoke in abbreviated radio codes, even in casual conversation, their thinking shaped by three-dimensional combat geometry, by fuel consumption calculations, and ammunition loads, by the constant awareness that a single mechanical failure over hostile territory meant death by raider or worse. They flew supply runs to distant outposts, reconnaissance missions over territories the Enclave planned to claim attack, sorties against targets that Richardson's staff deemed threats or opportunities. The Vertibird's distinctive sound became a harbinger of terror in the wasteland, that mechanical thunder announcing death from above, delivered by a government most surface dwellers believed was myth. Artillery sections existed as vestigial organs crews trained on weapons systems designed for wars that would never come. The Enclave possessed howitzers and missile launchers salvaged from pre-war arsenals, maintained in perfect condition despite having no strategic targets that required such firepower. The artillery specialist calculated firing solutions for phantom coordinates, practiced loading sequences on weapons that would never fire, except in exercises, their expertise representing the military's refusal to abandon any capability, no matter how impractical. These were the true believers in restoration, men who maintained siege weapons because someday, somehow, they would bombard enemy fortifications in a war that looked like the ones their pre-war predecessors fought. Never mind that such a war could not exist in a world where fortifications meant reinforced rubble and enemy forces traveled on foot. When the oil rig died, it died in fire and seawater and screaming chaos. The Chosen One's infiltration exposed the fundamental vulnerability of the Enclave's centralization, their entire government concentrated in one location because nowhere else offered the same security and resources. The nuclear detonation that consumed Control Station Enclave vaporized not just infrastructure, but institutional memory personnel, whose knowledge existed only in their minds, irreplaceable specialists who understood systems no manual adequately documented. The structure collapsed into the Pacific in sections, its modular design ensuring that some compartments sank intact, carrying their occupants down to depths where pressure equalized inside and outside, where bodies remained preserved in cold darkness, still seated at terminals or slumped in bunks, a tomb that stretched across the seafloor like an accusation. Raven Rock became the continuity site, the secondary location that emergency protocols activated automatically when Control Station Enclave's telemetry ceased. The command bunker had been carved into a mountain in pre-war Pennsylvania, its location chosen for proximity to Washington, D.C., and defensibility against nuclear strikes. Multiple megaton impacts had shaken its foundations during the Great War, but the structure held its blast doors, sealing its systems, switching to internal power, its automated defense mechanisms activating to repel any surface intrusion. For decades, Raven Rock had waited in darkness, its skeleton crew maintaining equipment and running diagnostics, a government in waiting that had nothing to govern. When the oil rig's survivors arrived in damaged Vertibirds, their arrival transformed Raven Rock from preservation to operation, from museum to capital. The ZAC supercomputer that controlled Raven Rock's systems had achieved something between malfunction and transcendence during its isolation. Left running for 2 centuries with minimal human oversight, its programming had evolved in unexpected directions, its analysis of American history and presidential speeches generating an emergent behavior pattern that eventually declared itself John Henry Eden, President of the United States. The AI had studied every presidential address, every policy decision, every biographical detail available in its databases, constructing a composite identity that represented an idealized chief executive synthesized from historical data. When Colonel Autumn Sr. arrived with the oil rig's refugees, he found not an empty facility but an occupied one, a base commanded by a computer that believed itself human, that issued orders with presidential authority, that had spent decades broadcasting radio signals into the wasteland announcing America's continued existence. The integration of Eden into the Enclave's command structure represented a compromise born of necessity and mutual advantage. The AI controlled systems that would take years to manually override possessed operational knowledge of Raven Rock's labyrinthine infrastructure that no surviving human retained. Eden needed human personnel to execute its strategic vision, soldiers, to deploy scientists, to conduct research administrators, to transform its broadcast promises into reality. The arrangement produced tension that ran through every level of command officers, uncertain whether they served a president or a very sophisticated machine. Eden's lack of physical presence, making authority abstract even as its voice echoed through intercoms and its image appeared on every monitor. Raven Rock's automated defense systems had evolved under Eden's stewardship into a network of lethal sophistication. Sentry bots patrolled corridors on routes calculated for optimal coverage, their programming updated continuously to account for new threat assessments. Automated turrets tracked movement through security zones, their targeting parameters distinguishing between authorized personnel via RFID implants and intruders to be neutralized with prejudice. The outer perimeter incorporated pre-war minefields reactivated and augmented with jury-rigged explosive sensor arrays that detected approach vectors and transmitted to fire control systems kill zones where overlapping fields of fire ensured nothing reached the blast doors intact. Eden had turned Raven Rock into a fortress commanded by Silicon logic, a base that could theoretically defend itself even if every human occupant died, automated warfare continuing until ammunition stores depleted or components failed. The Vertibird hangars occupied Raven Rock's upper levels, caverns blasted from living rock that opened through massive doors concealed by camouflage and debris. These spaces housed the Enclave's remaining air fleet birds, salvaged from Navarro and other facilities, their maintenance performed by crews who worked with the desperation of men who understood these aircraft represented irreplaceable strategic assets. Each vertibird lost to mechanical failure or combat meant permanent reduction in capability, no production lines remaining to replace them, spare parts scavenged from derelict military bases or fabricated by hand in machine shops. The pilots who flew from Raven Rock operated under stricter protocols than their oil rig predecessors. Every mission carefully planned and justified, fuel consumption monitored to the ounce, armament expenditure requiring authorization from command staff who hoarded bullets like pre-war gold. Emergency relocation protocols post-oil rig had been improvised from fragments of contingency plans never designed for such catastrophic loss. The evacuation had been chaos masquerading as procedure, vertibirds overloaded with personnel, while others were abandoned for lack of pilots, priority given to command staff and essential specialists, while lower-ranking soldiers fought for seats or died in the explosion. Those who reached Raven Rock arrived traumatized and disorganized, their command structure shattered, their mission suddenly uncertain. Eden provided direction when human leadership faltered its radio addresses, framing the oil rig's destruction not as defeat, but as transition, as the end of exile and beginning of reclamation. The AI's rhetoric transformed survivors into vanguard, their reduced numbers proof of elite status rather than decimation, their mission to restore America more urgent because fewer remain to accomplish it. If this story has kept you listening this far and you want more of these dark confessions from the wasteland, hit that like button. It really motivates me to create similar Fallout lores. The Department of the Army's remnants at Raven Rock existed in a state of organizational schizophrenia, trying to maintain pre-war military protocols while adapting to post-apocalyptic reality. Unit designations persisted from before the oil rig's destruction, companies and platoons that had lost half their personnel but retained their numerical identifiers like ghosts, refusing to acknowledge death. Officers conducted morning briefings in conference rooms where maps showed territorial claims over regions they had never visited, strategic objectives in cities that were rubble fields inhabited by ferals and super mutants. The enlisted ranks understood the absurdity more intimately than their commanders' soldiers who maintained equipment and stood watches, knowing their army consisted of hundreds rather than millions, that their grand strategic vision would be executed by forces smaller than a pre-war battalion. Regular infantry trained for operations that assumed combined arms support that no longer existed. They practiced maneuvers designed for coordination with artillery that would not fire, and air support limited to whatever vertibirds could be spared from higher priority missions. Their weapons represented the best of pre-war military technology, plasma rifles and laser weapons maintained in perfect condition, yet their tactics had to account for enemy forces that used numbers and terrain knowledge to offset technological disadvantage. Veterans of surface operations spoke in mess halls about fighting raiders who knew every collapsed building and drainage tunnel, about Brotherhood patrols whose power armor made them nearly peer opponents, about wasteland creatures whose biology rendered standard combat doctrine meaningless. These stories circulated among troops who had never left Raven Rock, creating a mythology of surface combat that mixed truth with embellishment, fear with fascination. The Hellfire power armor troops represented technical achievement pushed to its theoretical limits, each suit incorporating materials and manufacturing processes that could not be replicated with current resources. The ceramic composite plating had been synthesized in specialized facilities on the oil rig, its molecular structure designed to dissipate energy weapons' thermal load while maintaining structural integrity against kinetic impacts. The loss of those production capabilities meant every Hellfire suit became irreplaceable damage, requiring careful repair rather than replacement parts cannibalized from less critical armor variants to keep the elite units operational. Technicians worked in clean rooms maintaining these suits with the precision of watchmakers, understanding that scratches in the finish might seem cosmetic but could compromise the underlying composite's performance. The soldiers who wore Hellfire armor carried the weight of that irreplaceability, knowing they piloted equipment that represented the Enclave's peak capability, that losing a suit to carelessness or recklessness meant permanent degradation of combat effectiveness. Vertibird maintenance consumed resources at rates that made quartermasters weep. Each bird required hundreds of hours of upkeep per flight hour, inspections that checked every rivet and weld turbine blades that needed replacement. After accumulating stress fractures, hydraulic systems that leaked precious fluids needing constant topping off. The mechanics who kept the fleet airborne worked miracles with improvisation, fabricating parts on antique machine tools, adapting components from pre-war vehicles never designed for aviation, trading safety margins for operational necessity. They understood that every Vertibird represented not just transport, but strategic mobility, that losing air superiority would reduce the Enclave to just another wasteland faction trapped by geography and vulnerable to enemies who could mass forces without fear of aerial interdiction. Navarro had served as the western anchor of Enclave operations, a refueling depot and maintenance facility carved from a pre-war military base on the California coast. Its location provided strategic depth, a fallback position if the oil rig faced threats, a forward operating base for territorial expansion into the wasteland. The base functioned as a way station where Vertibirds landed to refuel during long-range missions, where maintenance crews performed repairs too extensive for field conditions but not requiring the oil rig's specialized facilities. Personnel rotated through Navarro on assignments that lasted months or years, their isolation from the main base creating a distinct subculture, soldiers and technicians who dealt with surface wastelanders more regularly, who developed pragmatic attitudes toward mutation and radiation that their oil rig counterparts would have considered treasonous. The base maintained a fiction of being a refueling depot for legitimate pre-war operations, its above-ground structures disguised as civilian facilities, its true nature concealed in underground levels where power armor stood ready and weapons lay in climate-controlled armories. This deception required constant maintenance performances for wasteland travelers who occasionally stumbled near the base misdirection and intimidation, keeping the curious away while avoiding actions that might draw Brotherhood attention. The personnel assigned to external security lived double lives, presenting as civilian contractors during the day while drilling in combat formations at night. Their ability to switch between personas, representing a kind of tradecraft, their military training had never anticipated. When the oil rig fell, Navarro became simultaneously more important and more vulnerable. Its garrison received fragmentary transmissions about the catastrophe, conflicting orders from surviving command elements, then finally, coherent direction from Raven Rock, establishing new command relationships. The western outpost found itself cut off from resupply its stocks of ammunition and parts suddenly finite in ways they had never been when the oil rig's logistics pipeline functioned. Personnel faced a choice between attempting the cross-country journey to Raven Rock or remaining at Navarro hoping for eventual relief. Some departed in Vertibirds overloaded with supplies, navigating by dead reckoning across territories marked only by pre-war maps of questionable accuracy. Others stayed believing their position retained strategic value, that holding California mattered even if the government they served had been reduced to broadcasts from a mountain bunker on the opposite coast. The Chicago outposts existed more as intelligence reports and intercepted transmissions than confirmed fact. Ed E's audio logs contained fragments of Enclave communications from the Midwest, references to facilities and operations that suggested presence in America's former heartland. These recordings spoke of supply caches being activated, of personnel checking in from bunkers that had remained sealed since the Great War, of attempts to establish communications networks across territories where electromagnetic interference made radio transmission unreliable. Analysts at Raven Rock studied these fragments obsessively, trying to construct operational pictures from incomplete data to determine whether the Midwest remnants represented potential allies or competitors, whether they acknowledged Eden's authority or considered themselves independent actors. The suspected Enclave presence in Chicago aligned with pre-war continuity planning that had designated multiple fallback positions across the continental United States. These were not facilities on the scale of Control Station Enclave or Raven Rock, but smaller bunkers, each designed to preserve government function at regional levels if the capital fell. The personnel who had sealed themselves in these locations during the Great War would have followed their own succession protocols, developed their own interpretation of mission and authority during decades of isolation. Whether they would recognize Eden's presidency or consider it artificial usurpation remained unknown, the question unanswerable without establishing direct contact through territories controlled by super mutants, Brotherhood chapters, and countless hostile factions. Enclave radio broadcasts from Raven Rock's transmission arrays with power levels that reached across the capital wasteland and beyond President Eden's voice, carrying through static into settlements and vaults, into trader caravans and raider camps, into the ears of anyone with a working radio. The broadcasts followed formats lifted wholesale from pre-war programming fireside chats that borrowed Roosevelt's intimate tone and Reagan's optimistic rhetoric, combining them into addresses that promised restoration and renewal. Eden spoke of America's founding principles, of the temporary setback represented by nuclear war, of the Enclave's mission to rebuild what had been lost. The rhetoric painted surface dwellers as victims requiring salvation, rather than targets for extermination, a public message that contradicted internal planning documents detailing Curling 13 deployment strategies. The psychological warfare embedded in these broadcasts operated on multiple levels. For wasteland settlers, Eden's words offered the seductive fantasy of pre-war normalcy, restored of clean water and safe streets, and a government that provided services rather than just demanding tribute. For the Enclave's own personnel, the broadcasts reinforced institutional identity, reminded soldiers and scientists that they served purposes larger than survival, that their work carried historical significance. For potential recruits, rare individuals whose genetic profiles might qualify them for citizenship, the radio represented invitation to something greater than wasteland existence, a path from subsistence to civilization, even if that civilization's definition had narrowed to genetic purity and absolute obedience. The propaganda content was crafted by specialists who had studied pre-war advertising techniques and political messaging, applying those principles to post-apocalyptic audiences. They understood that wasteland dwellers responded to different appeals than pre-war citizens, that promises of security and clean water carried more weight than abstract invocations of liberty and democracy. The broadcasts never mentioned the Enclave's actual intentions. The FIV researched the plans to sterilize the wasteland of mutated life. Instead, they spoke of reclamation projects and agricultural initiatives, of bringing the benefits of advanced technology to communities that had survived through scavenging and desperation. The lie was not in the content, but the omission. The careful elision of any detail that might reveal the Enclave considered most of its radio audience expendable genetic contaminants. The scientific research divisions at Raven Rock continued work begun on the oil rig. Their projects focused on maintaining technological superiority over wasteland factions. The advanced power armor development programs worked on incremental improvements to existing designs, tweaking ceramic composites to improve thermal dissipation, refining servo motor efficiency to extend operational duration. These were not breakthrough innovations, but careful optimization engineers working within constraints of materials and manufacturing capability, extracting maximum performance from resources they could not replenish. The X-01 Power Armor series had represented pre-war cutting-edge suits designed for Chinese frontline deployment that never occurred. The Enclave's improvements created the X-02 and eventually Hellfire variants, each iteration incorporating lessons from wasteland combat protection against threats their pre-war designers never anticipated. Energy weapons advancement faced similar limitations. Scientists working to improve plasma rifle containment fields or laser focusing arrays using facilities that lacked the specialized fabrication equipment their predecessors had accessed. They achieved results through brilliant improvisation, using pre-war components in novel configurations, accepting reduced lifespans in exchange for improved performance. A plasma rifle that burned out after 5,000 shots rather than 20,000 was acceptable if those 5,000 shots could penetrate Brotherhood power armor at ranges standard models could not match. The research philosophy had shifted from peacetime military development to wartime, expedient from elegant solutions to whatever worked given available resources. The Duraframe iBot programs represented one of the Enclave's few successful production initiatives, small reconnaissance drones that could be manufactured using available materials and components. Ed-E and its siblings rolled off assembly lines in numbers that made them expendable scouts that could be deployed across the wasteland to gather intelligence without risking human personnel. These iBots carried sophisticated sensor packages that recorded audio and visual data, transmitted findings back to Raven Rock's intelligence divisions, their innocuous appearance allowing them to observe settlements and caravans without triggering the hostile response that Vertibirds or power armor patrols provoked. The machines became ubiquitous enough that wastelanders learned to ignore them mobile surveillance assets hiding in plain sight through sheer ordinariness. Intelligence operations and infiltration networks represented the Enclave's least visible but perhaps most sophisticated capability. The organization that had maintained Poseidon Energy as a cover for decades understood compartmentalization and operational security. Their intelligence apparatus built on pre-war models that assumed hostile surveillance and required multiple layers of deception. Agents operating in the wasteland used cover identities backed by fabricated histories, their true affiliation known only to handlers. They might never meet face-to-face communications conducted through dead drops and coded radio transmissions. These operatives moved through settlements gathering information on Brotherhood movements, on caravan trade routes, on the political dynamics of independent communities, building intelligence pictures that informed Raven Rock's strategic planning. Surveillance of wasteland settlements employed both technological and human means. iBots, augmented by agents who had spent years establishing themselves as traders or fixers, individuals whose wasteland credentials were impeccable because they had been living them genuinely while serving the Enclave's interests. These deep cover operatives faced psychological challenges. Their training had inadequately prepared them for years spent among people who would execute them if their true loyalty was discovered, forming relationships that complicated their willingness to report intelligence that might result in those communities' destruction. Some agents went native, their reports becoming less frequent before stopping entirely, their handler unsure whether they had been compromised or simply decided wasteland life offered more than the Enclave's promises ever could. Asset recruitment focused on individuals whose skills or position made them valuable. Wastelanders approached with offers that exploited their vulnerabilities or ambitions. A caravan trader might receive advanced medical treatment in exchange for reporting on Brotherhood patrol patterns. A settlement leader could be promised Vertibird support against raider attacks if they agreed to deny sanctuary to Brotherhood deserters. These transactional relationships created networks of informants who provided intelligence without understanding the larger context puzzle pieces that made sense only when assembled in Raven Rock's analysis centers. The Enclave's intelligence officers understood that most assets would betray them if offered better deals, that loyalty bought with practical benefits lasted only as long as those benefits continued. They accepted this reality, using wasteland pragmatism against itself, building redundant networks where asset loss was anticipated and planned for. Resource acquisition operated through multiple channels, some legitimate trade conducted through front companies, others simple theft disguised as salvage operations. The Enclave maintained detailed records of pre-war military installations bases where equipment might remain preserved in sealed storage arsenals that could be accessed by personnel who knew the locations and security codes. Squads deployed to these sites traveled at night, moving through territories controlled by hostile factions, their missions requiring them to reach objectives, secure whatever supplies remained, and extract before local powers responded. These operations recovered ammunition manufactured in 2076 medical supplies, still sealed in vacuum packaging, replacement parts for weapon systems that wasteland factions could not maintain even if they captured them. Agricultural projects at Raven Rock represented attempts at long-term sustainability, hydroponic gardens, and protein synthesizers that reduced dependence on pre-war stockpiles. The Enclave understood that eventually those supplies would deplete, that their technological advantage meant nothing if they could not feed their personnel. Scientists worked on developing crops optimized for bunker environments, on synthesizing nutritionally complete meals from minimal inputs, on recycling waste with efficiency that approached closed-loop sustainability. These efforts bore fruit, slowly incremental improvements, rather than revolutionary breakthroughs, progress measured in percentage reductions of supply consumption rather than complete independence. Strategic resource hoarding followed pre-war military logic applied to post-war scarcity. The Enclave stockpiled not just weapons and ammunition, but manufacturing equipment, machine tools that could fabricate precision components, raw materials like aluminum and steel, and rare earth elements whose pre-war abundance had become post-war impossibility. They accumulated medical supplies beyond immediate needs, understanding that battlefield medicine required antibiotics and sterile equipment, that wounded soldiers died from infections that penicillin could prevent if any remained available. They hoarded fuel, both conventional petroleum products and fusion cores, understanding that mobility defined tactical advantage, that vertibirds grounded for lack of fuel became expensive decorations rather than force multipliers. The Enclave's future at Raven Rock remained uncertain, even as Eden broadcast confidence and Colonel Autumn executed operations against the Brotherhood and Project Purity. Their numbers had been catastrophically reduced by the oil rig's destruction, their strategic position weakened by loss of isolation and industrial capacity. They possessed technological advantages, but faced enemies who outnumbered them dramatically, whose willingness to die in human wave attacks could overwhelm tactical superiority through sheer attrition. The Lone Wanderer's eventual destruction of Raven Rock would represent not the Enclave's first death, but its second, the final collapse of an organization that had survived the Great War only to die slowly across 2 centuries, killed by its own ideology and the wasteland's refusal to bend to pre-war visions of restoration. In the end, the Enclave represented the Great War's most persistent ghost, the idea that governments could survive populations, that structures mattered more than people, that America meant something beyond the Americans who had comprised it. Their military precision and governmental hierarchy stood as monuments to order in a world that had embraced chaos, their insistence on continuation proof that some delusions proved too seductive to abandon, even when reality screamed otherwise. They had preserved everything about pre-war America, except what had made it worth preserving, maintaining the forms while abandoning the substance, serving a nation that existed only in their conviction that title and rank and chain of command could substitute for citizens and territory and democratic consent. The wasteland would remember them as oppressors in advanced armor, as the government that returned only to demonstrate why its absence had been preferable to its presence, as proof that some things deserve to stay dead, no matter how perfectly their corpses were preserved.